first keynote speaker. Sean Horton is a professor in the Department of Kinesiology at the University of Windsor. His research has a lifespan focus with an emphasis on individuals who have traditionally been disadvantaged or marginalized in our society. Sean is the co-director of the APEX Research Group, which has been operating for over a decade, providing sport and exercise programming for adults with an intellectual and developmental disability. All of the APEX programs and associated research projects have involved members of the autistic community. And I will now pass it off to Sean.
Great, thank you, Amy. I'm hoping everybody can hear me okay. It is my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonathan Weiss, who is a professor in the Department of Psychology at York University and a clinical psychologist. He currently holds the York University Research Chair in Autism and Neurodevelopmental Disability Mental Health. His research focuses on the prevention and treatment of mental health problems in autistic people or those with intellectual disabilities. He studies the impact of stressors such as bullying or transitions and how cognitive behavior therapy can help youth with mental health problems. Dr. Weiss conducts studies of the changing service needs and barriers to service use for autistic people and their families across the lifespan. So I think Dr. Weiss is an ideal person to be leading off our two-day symposium. So Dr. Weiss, we are very much looking forward to your talk, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Sean, for that introduction, both here and virtually. It's my pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation to kick off a two-day symposium that starts with the word innovations. I think that that's a perfect example of what we need to be thinking, and I agree totally with Homa when she was underscoring the need for innovations, not just technological, but in terms of the way we think about supporting autism and policies around autism, et cetera. I want to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to do this. You know, we've been talking at some point around having this conversation about autism innovations for over 2 years now. So it's really a delight to be here in person. This is my first in-person event. And so thanks for that opportunity. Not yet. No, I am. Okay. And I'll do my best not to stress out the tech team behind the scenes as well. So I'm a clinical psychologist, as you heard from Sean, and my work is focused on mental health and supporting the mental health of autistic people and people with other developmental disabilities. So when I was invited to consider a keynote around innovations when it comes to mental health, what I hope you take away from what I'll be presenting today is an innovation not in a particular tool or a particular intervention, but instead innovation in the way we think about what we need to do to support mental health of autistic people. And I want to give you some examples of that. So the real innovation here that I'm putting forward in whatever we think about in the next 2 days is an innovation of individual contextual approaches to mental health. Rather than thinking about the individual or the context, but thinking about how do our innovations, how do our efforts increase the alignment between the individual and the context. And I want to give examples of really concrete examples of what I mean by that. So I want to give examples of how we can intervene at an individual level with an autistic person, how we can intervene at a relational level. In this case, I'll talk about family as that relationship, but it's just one example of relationships. And more broadly, context or community, and what we can do more broadly in terms of societal interventions, specific to mental health and autism. But I want to take us back to an old book that my parents used to read to me, The Missing Piece, Meets the Big O by Shel Silverstein. So I'm not going to go through the whole story, but just to say that it starts off essentially that there's this missing piece that's sat alone, waiting for someone to come along and take it somewhere, right? And eventually that other piece comes in and it becomes a whole circle. And it rolls along and it picks up speed, and then that has momentum. Right? And it changes the way that we do things and the way that we move. And when so far, I think what typically interventions are like when it comes to mental health and autism is what we're doing is we're thinking about it as individual pieces. So we have things like, I'll give you examples of, that are thought of alone in a silo or fragmented from the other pieces, right? And it's only in thinking about this together that we get that actually that holistic approach, which is really what's needed when we talk about quality of life. How could we ever imagine intervening and improving somebody's quality of life with one single intervention, right? And of course, no one size fits all when it comes to autism. Not only do we have to think across these different dimensions when it comes to mental health, but we also have to think across understanding the uniqueness that comes with autism. How could we ever have one intervention, one approach that would suit the unique socio-communicative and behavioral differences that are a part of autism, right? With such heterogeneity, we need to think of things holistically and in terms of a broader principle-based approach that can pull specific interventions that are well suited to every individual's needs. So let's talk a bit about mental health now. I'm going to focus on that in the presentation. So what do I even mean by mental health? When I said mental health, I suspect that many people were thinking, or I'm going to guess that many people were thinking of words like anxiety or depression or distress or suicide, right? Or other kind of negative terms and constructs that are real and important to address and that people need support for. But mental health is not just that. Mental health is not just conditions of thoughts or moods or behaviors that negatively impact our lives. Mental health is also our ability and our experience of acting and feeling in ways that enhance our life, that are a positive sense of emotional and spiritual well-being. Ones that are aligned to a person's culture, to aspects of social justice and equity and interconnections. So when we're really talking about interventions that address mental health, we can't just think about alleviating symptoms of problems, right? Mental health has to take, again, a balanced approach. And maybe that's an innovation in and of itself, is to say, how do our interventions not only reduce things like anxiety, but how do our interventions also move society towards a more social justice and equity lens, one that respects cultural diversity and the intersectionality that comes with living, right? When it comes to mental health, it's really important also that we don't think and we don't pathologize mental health as autism as a mental health problem. You know, clinically, when we're thinking about problems with mental health, often what I do is we start with the idea of what is a person's usual, what is their baseline? Not comparing every individual to what would be expected kind of in a neurotypical situation for an holistic person, but for their own unique situation. I used to work with a young man with autism who didn't have language as a way of expressing himself, but I knew he welcomed me into his home because every time that I would go into that environment, he would open and close his windows in his apartment in exactly the same way. And it was his ritual of saying hello to me. And so that is not a mental health problem. So if I didn't know autism and if I didn't know him, I might conceptualize that as obsessive compulsive disorder or as a compulsive problem that had to be intervened with. When in fact, that was his way of saying hello. And the problem was when I came into his apartment and he wasn't doing that. And he sat there on the couch, not compulsively opening and closing his windows the way that I expected him to because I knew him, right? That was the signal of something that could be going wrong. So it really is about their usual, and I'm not the only person to suggest this. In the UK, they have a whole mental health literacy initiative called Know Your Normal. In speaking with autistic adults here in Canada, the preference is not to talk about things as normal or not, but instead to really talk about what is a person's usual or their typical, right? And understanding our own typical, what's normal for us, what's usual for us, helps us to be aware of when there are changes from that, right? Which could be the first signals of what might be considered anxiety or depression or so on. But mental health problems is not just about autism. When we talk about mental health problems, we have a lot of data to show that mental health problems are more common for kids and teens with developmental disabilities, more broadly speaking, right? There's been some landmark studies done often from the United Kingdom, where they love their census data, their population-based data. Work by Vaso Tutsika and colleagues looked at 18,000 young people in the United Kingdom. And this was just a parent report kind of survey that they used, the Strength and Difficulties Questionnaire, which is a valid kind of screener. And they had parents, they didn't do it, but the census had 18,000 parents of young people complete this questionnaire about emotional problems and hyperactivity and so on. And then it gives kind of cutoffs. And the take home behind this is that about 1 in 5 young people, according to their parents, but 1 in 5 young people who don't have a developmental disability had clinically significant levels of an emotional problem or hyperactivity or behavioral challenges, right? So mental health and the conversation of mental health is a conversation that suits everyone. When we're talking about 1 in 5 is usual, right? And this was pre-pandemic. That jumps to, for people with intellectual disability who might not have autism, a 42%. So a much higher rate of emotional difficulties. And that's not considering autism. But for autistic people, with or without intellectual disability, the rates are even higher. So the take home behind this graph is that when we talk about mental health initiatives, we have to think about how do we help those be suited, these innovations, for autism, but more broadly, how can these same innovations support young people with other developmental differences and young people more generally? Does it have to be autism specific? Or can a rising tide lift all boats? It's also not just about kids. We've done research in Ontario where we were able to collaborate. This is with the Healthcare Access and Developmental Disabilities Research Program, HCARD, led by Yona Linsky at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, where we were able to use the administrative data of our Medicaid numbers, right? Our OHIP kind of card number, our numbers, where we're able to kind of look at codes related to autism, related to developmental disabilities, related to psychiatric diagnoses in, for example, the last 2 years. And one of the things that we were able to identify in saying which young people, so this is of all young people in Ontario who are swiping OHIP cards, right? Of young adults, in this case, it was about young adults, 18 to 25 years of age, which young people with autism have a psychiatric diagnosis in their kind of query. If a psychiatrist kind of enters a code after seeing a patient, it gets logged in kind of this administrative data set. So we're able to look at that population-based work. And it turns out that 50% of young people who have an autism diagnosis on their OHIP file also have at least one psychiatric diagnosis in the last 2 years. Okay, it's about 38% for young adults with other developmental disabilities, not autism, but other developmental disability labels. Also much higher than the 1 in 5 young adults in Ontario who don't have any developmental disability diagnosis in their medical file. So again, mental health is something for everyone. It's more prevalent needs to be more prevalent as a focus for people with developmental disabilities, more broadly speaking, and it's particular to autism. It's not just about psychiatric diagnosis, but when we look at substance-related or addictions issues, lots of times when we think about mental health, we don't consider addictions. But it turns out that there are about much higher rates, while it looks a lot smaller compared to the general psychiatric diagnosis kind of ones. If we look at addictions, it is much higher for those with autism or other developmental disabilities compared to the general population of young adults in Ontario. Okay. Now, as I said, the absence of mental health problems is not really the same thing as good mental health. If I were to ask you here, what does successful living mean to you? Right? People here in the room, for the people online, if I were to ask you, how would you describe successful living for yourself? You wouldn't just say, well, successful living to me, quality of life to me, means having a T-score of 50 instead of a T-score of 55 on this questionnaire. It wouldn't mean having 4 symptoms of depression instead of 6, right? It would mean something. You wouldn't be using that language to talk about good living. You would probably be using language like, I'm going to venture, and maybe people in the chat online are putting it in, contentment or satisfaction, or balance, or resilience, or happiness, or for some people, no crisis or no distress, and so on. So I think there's lots of different ways to consider how we even talk about the constructs that we can measure when it comes to quality of life. Quality of life is not just one thing. So I want to suggest, and this hopefully is the biggest innovation from my talk, is that we consider mental health and mental health problems as a matter of individual contextual alignment or misalignment in autism. So what do I mean by this? Let me give a concrete example. So this work came from Jeffrey Wood and Ken Godow many years ago, when they were talking about why are there such high rates of anxiety problems in autistic young people. So they suggested that autistic people experience many autism-related stressors in their life, not because of their autism alone, but because they're autistic in a non-autistic society that essentially they're confronted with and bump up to all the time. Right? For example, social confusion or the unpredictability of the neurotypical social world, right? That's not necessarily a problem for the autistic person if they're in an environment and other people are not reading them well, right? And not understanding them and not tailoring their approaches. But it turns out in neurotypical situations, there's a lot of social confusion, a lot of social stress. So that elevates the stressors. That's an autism-related stressor. Or peer rejection and victimization. We've done work at York University, and many people have done work elsewhere to identify how autistic people, both children and adults, are at a far greater risk of experiencing interpersonal violence, whether it's bullying or abuse by people they know or don't know. Right? These might be very, very acute events or chronic, subtle situations of violence. The third is being prevented from being able to engage in the interests or activities that are something that's important to you. If I really want to focus, my pleasure comes from talking about fish, and I'm not able to talk about fish because in my classroom, for example, we have to shift and focus on another topic. I might not be able to talk about fish, but I have to suppress that important kind of urge, that desire. And if I have to do that every day, day in and day out, that's going to wear on me. Or lastly, having frequent sensory experiences that are aversive, right? The lights in this room right now, for example, might to some people be highly problematic. They might be pushing through and sticking with it because they value kind of what we're doing here, but it's still a stressor in their lives. So these are just examples of common autism-related stressors. It's not an autism problem. It's a problem of the misalignment between that person's autism, that autistic person, and the way they're wired, and their environments. And that leads to negative affectivity, negative emotions, situations of anxiety, and so on. And then there are consequences to those. Things like withdrawing from social situations, things like engaging in more kind of ritualized behaviors because that's the only thing that calms us, that makes us feel kind of okay again, right? And what do these things do if we start to engage in those kinds of effects, those consequences? We experience more autism-related stressors. The misalignment grows. So interventions are not just about the person, but it's about stopping that misalignment and preventing it from growing and reducing that misalignment. Positive mental health is also about alignment. So Richard Lerner has long spoken, this was through the 4-H study in the United States, talked about measured thriving. Thriving as a young person experiencing competence, confidence in their abilities, connections with others, developing character, knowing right from wrong, being able to express and experience caring, empathy, and sympathy, and being able to contribute to themselves or others and people in meaningful ways. So Richard Lerner measured this in the general kind of young people kind of population, and we've done measuring these aspects of thriving with autistic people and with people with intellectual disabilities. So I'll share some of that information with you in coming slides. But the idea behind this is that how do people grow in these C's, in these 6 C's? Right? What do you need to grow in your thriving over time? Well, you need certain intrinsic individual strengths, right? We all have strengths. Autistic people have their own unique strengths, right, that they bring to every situation. And they're all different. If we measured our strengths in this room, we'd have a varied set across all of us, whether it's academic or cognitive or physical or emotional strengths. But that has to align with their ecologies, with their contexts, whether it's the kind of people in their lives or the resources that are there, or the opportunities that are there. If one of my strengths is that I'm incredibly detail oriented, I am highly focused on ensuring that things are supposed to be in the places that they're supposed to be in. And I will not stop until things, and I persevere when things are disordered, so until they're ordered, right? That strength, that's not a pathology, it's not a problem. That strength is well aligned with a workplace environment that requires, for example, sorting, that requires that kind of diligence. Think about what has to go into kind of a library and making a library run smoothly. So aligning so that's what I mean by alignments. And the more we have this alignment, both for people, non-autistic people, and this has been shown empirically, but also with autistic people, the greater that alignment, the more of these C's are endorsed. And the more of these C's are endorsed, we see a reduction in mental health challenges as well, but that's not the point. Is that fair? The last suggestion conceptually is one that thriving and mental health problems are not along the same continuum per se. The absence, we don't go from mental health issues to thriving and just on one continuum or one spectrum. When we think about spectrum here, we can think about things in two continua, and Keyes and others have talked about a dual continua model. The Mental Health Commission of Canada has pointed to considering mental health as a dual continuum model. The idea is that we can vary along dimensions of mental health problems. So somebody might have high mental health problems like the anxiety that I talked about, or no symptoms of anxiety. But we can also vary in terms of positive mental health. So this is kind of high mental health would be thriving, and low mental health would be the lack of thriving, would be what we call languishing. So for example, how many people here, have experienced panic attacks in their life? Probably many people, right? It's quite common. I've had panic attacks in my life, legitimate panic attacks that have interfered with my ability to kind of do things. That would be along this mental health problem dimension. But how many of those same people who are thinking to themselves, yeah, I've had panic attacks, have also experienced high degrees of connectedness to others and of caring with others and contributed in tremendously meaningful ways to society and have experiences of joy, not because they're no longer experiencing those panic symptoms, right? Alongside those panic symptoms, maybe not exactly that same moment, but in their life more generally. So we can think about continua of flourishing with mental health problems, which I kind of mentioned. This is having those mental health issues, but at the same time, having those C's, flourishing with no mental health problems, languishing, so that's the absence of that connectedness and those character, being stuck in your apartment, in your basement, without a place to go, without the ability or opportunity to reach out and be connected to others. But we might not also have high levels of depression or high levels of anxiety, or having both. So the innovations that we're talking about might be about moving along dimensions of mental health symptoms, or it might be actually saying, in spite of that, how can we move people along this dimension from languishing to flourishing, right? Or how do we move them from this quadrant to this quadrant of languishing with mental health problems to flourishing with no mental health problems? So there's so many different ways that we can do this. Some brief examples. This is not a clinical class. I'm not going to do trainings or anything, but for example, at the individual level, how can we know that there's science that tells us we can do something about moving people along that dimension. Cognitive behavior therapy is a good example of that. So cognitive behavior therapy, CBT, has been used, and there's been a number of meta-analyses and systematic reviews that have shown that it can be helpful to reduce anxiety problems or depression. In our case at York University, we've done work on emotion regulation and reducing emotional dysregulation using CBT for autistic people. The caveat here that I want to leave is before you go out and buy all these manuals that you can see here, and there's tons of manuals that exist, is that the actual effect sizes are typically small to medium. And what does that mean? It means that over these kind of brief manualized approaches, while we see important gains, those gains are not necessarily gigantic. And number of people who participate in these interventions don't benefit. Right? So it's not for everybody, but it does work for some people. And by the way, these are just some examples of the manuals that exist. The green and the red that you see here, the Exploring Feelings manuals by Tony Atwood. One's about CBT for anger and one for anxiety, and there's no difference in the actual content other than the word anxiety and anger in the manuals and the color of the front. It's exactly the same activities in both. How could it be that it's exactly the same activities in both? Because we don't have to think and get stuck specifically at the level of one symptom to help somebody. They both help, but you don't have to go out and buy both. Mindfulness is another kind of mindfulness-based activities, another kind of interventions that's increasingly being used along that continuum. So we know now the data is not as strong as for CBT. We still need more research, and there are a lot of important caveats. The most important is that while there seems to be some benefit of participating in mindfulness-based activities, and we've done some of this work at York University as well, and we see this change from pre to post intervention, we have very little data to say that those gains last after a person stops the mindfulness activities. So you have to consider how useful is this initiative if after a person stops doing it and they're going to stop doing it, it's no longer helpful. Right? So this is not to say people shouldn't participate in mindfulness-based activities, but it's important that we know the limits of what we know and what we don't know. I think that for some people, this is a tremendous benefit, especially if they continue to use that. The same way as if we think about going to the gym and exercising and developing good physical activity skills and physical literacy skills. As long as a person continues to use those, they experience the benefits. But if one goes to the gym for 10 weeks and then just stops and sits on the couch for the rest of their life, they're not going to maintain those benefits. And the same thing goes for mindfulness activities, mind-based exercises. But critically, most of these individual level interventions compare, when we do group trials, compare people to usual care. And unfortunately, in most situations, usual care means almost no care at all when it comes to mental health problems for CBT. Maybe there is something out there in the community, but traditionally, it's been like a wait list initiative where on the wait list, you're not really getting anything. So you're comparing getting something to getting basically nothing. And the studies that have actually done, some of the studies that have done comparisons, for example, CBT, like a specific type, exposure with response prevention to anxiety management therapy, or CBT compared to another type of therapy called non-directive person-centered counseling, or CBT compared to mindfulness-based stress reduction, or CBT compared to a really well-run group recreational activity. For different groups that you can see here, mostly teens or adults, for different kind of red lines. You know, what all of these things have in common is that in both groups, there's the same amount of change that's reported in these kind of these targets. Okay, it doesn't mean that one's effective and one's not. It's that both seem to show the similar degrees of effectiveness. Not everybody benefits. Some people do. Right? So it's not just about the CBT. It's about having opportunities to engage in meaningful activities and initiatives that are well suited to a person, that are aligned with a person. Oh, and there's another one that I'll highlight for teens, a social recreation program that is fantastic. CBT compared to having an amazing bowling pizza night. I'm not saying all they did was bowling and pizza, but that's what I mean by activities. So instead of doing things like exposure with response prevention and learning to talk about your emotions and rating your emotions, I'm a CBT therapist. I love doing that kind of stuff. But instead of doing that, coming to a group environment where you get to play video games and participate in something along peers that are like you, guess what? The same degree of anxiety reductions is reported in both situations. At the family level, we know, and this is talked about, and work done here at Calgary, led by Carly McMorris and her team here in Calgary, has looked at the impact of COVID and COVID-related stressors on the family. And that research identifies both high degrees of stressors, but also a tremendous amount of resilience in family members and in care providers. And we can think about initiatives that are well suited to families as a relational level intervention, as ones that help people balance the demands that they experience with their capabilities and their resources, and ones that do so in ways that support the way they make sense of their life and understand their world, right? So it's not about just reducing problems. Sometimes initiatives are about removing the demands that exist. And sometimes they're not about removing the demands, they're about accepting that those demands are there and are real life parts of their life, but it's about adding resources, maybe formal resources, maybe informal resources. The data suggests a whole bunch of different kinds of interventions can support family well-being. And as a result, having healthier families means having healthier developing individuals within those families. Things like acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindful parenting more broadly. What we've done at York is we brought in an intervention from the Netherlands called My Mind, which is a concurrent parent, teen, young adult initiative where parents do their own mindfulness activities and teens do their own mindfulness activities. And what's interesting about that is that we saw tremendous gains for both parents, or not tremendous, we saw excellent gains for parents and for the young people who are participating in this mindfulness-based initiative during the course of the treatment, but not necessarily afterwards or long-term maintenance. And more importantly, as one autistic young person told us, I'd like to expressly identify in the feedback that it was not the mindfulness activities that led to my reduction in anxiety and my improved quality of life. It was sharing pizza with other young autistic people. I never met another young autistic person before, right? So I want to give credence. Just because we see these changes, it doesn't mean it's because of the active ingredients that we think it is. But overall, these initiatives do seem to help a number of family members. A powerful story of what we've also done is we've looked at family members as empirically, can that be a form of resilience for autistic young people? And we did a study a number of years ago now where we looked at the impact of bullying on autistic young people in terms of their anxiety. This was just a correlational study, but nonetheless, it kind of highlights that importance of supporting the family. What we did here is, if you can imagine, this is a continuum that goes from not at all being bullied to experiencing bullying 2 or more times per week. And it doesn't matter who you are, the more you're experiencing chronic bullying, the more anxiety you're likely going to express as a group, right? It's going to go up for everyone. But what we also did is we stratified or broke this up by the degree of positive affect and the lack of kind of stress that was expressed by parents. And these were all autistic families. And this is not to pathologize. It's not saying that people who are showing low levels of positive affect were bad parents. Far from it. It's just relative to those who are expressing high or moderate levels. What we saw is that the more positive affect that parents reported that they express to their child and about their child, the less there was a correlation, a relationship between the bullying and anxiety. And the lower you were in terms of how you expressed positive emotions, the stronger that relationship was. So parent warmth was a moderator of essentially the relationship between bullying and anxiety. If we can support parent well-being, we can help boost the resilience in young autistic people. We did a TEDx talk, a TEDx series on autism a number of years ago, and parents spoke, gave this really powerful talk on being a parent and supporting autistic children. And this is an example of something he shared in the TEDx. It's a picture of X-ray, right, as you can see. And you see, what you see here in the middle is, and I'm not a physician or an X-ray technologist, but I'm going to paraphrase. This is the autistic young person's arm. Right? He was in an accident, had to go get his arm X-rayed. And this is his, and the 2 hands you see are his father's hands. His father, to help his son get X-rayed, had to put himself in the X-ray machine as well. Not to hold his kid down, but to support his child's ability to even engage in that physical medical procedure. And it's such a powerful picture to me of what families contribute to the well-being and quality of life of autistic loved ones, to the point that they'll put themselves in the way of X-rays to support their children's well-being. So the last thing I'll talk about is at the contextual level. So I've talked about the individual and I've talked about the family. Let me talk about the context and the community. For the last number of years, we had funding from Public Health Agency of Canada and working alongside CAMH to develop autism mental health literacy guide. So this is an autistic guide that's freely available for people to download. It's currently being translated into French. It involves both written materials as well as 6 videos that were produced by autistic people for autistic people. And what we did is over a period of 2 years, we virtually worked with 29 advisors to develop the content and the structure, not only the words, but the way the words look and are being used around improving not their mental health, but how we share knowledge about autism and mental health for autistic people. But it wasn't just the autistic advisors were very clear. This is meant for society more broadly. This information is meant to educate others about autism in a way that will help us with our mental health. If we can help educate educators, physicians, the person at the grocery store, and family members and neighbors and so on about the accepting and appreciating the neurodivergence that is autism, if we can change the way that they also support me if I'm experiencing crisis or a meltdown, or if I'm feeling the need to camouflage or mask, if they learn that better, that will help me with my mental health more. Okay. So this guide is something, I won't go into all of the details of it, but I want to highlight this as an initiative, as an innovation around how we share knowledge differently by empowering autistic people and their experiences to be at the forefront of what they need when it comes to supporting their quality of life. Here are just examples. These are the guide sections to give you a snapshot. We do things like defining mental health literacy, understanding mental health, what is autism, autism combined with mental health, understanding that within the context of autism. And then we talk about things like how to understand mental health challenges, strategies for well-being, formal supports and informal supports, and then a specific aspect on crisis and for families. So you can kind of download each section separately or as a whole 250-page document. Another example empirically of addressing things in the community, the importance of the community, comes from work by Lauren Bishop and colleagues from the Weiss Center. They have this tremendous longitudinal study of autistic people where they followed autistic people from childhood into adulthood. And one of the things they looked at was autistic people self-reported and parent-reported access to recreational activities. And what they found is that, just like we found that warmth was a buffer, that access to recreational activities, physical activity and leisure activities, was a buffer between the degree of stress an autistic person experiences and their quality of life. That is, stress is going to be a part of life, especially if you have autism-related stressors. Well, it turns out that, yes, it's true that the more autism-related stressors you have, the lower your quality of life is going to be that you're going to report on. But if you have access to high-quality, meaningful recreational activities, that is not an individual or a family-level intervention. That's a policy that somebody said, an initiative that's in their environment. That changes the relationship. If you have access to that, you're not impacted as much by the stress in your life. That's unavoidable. So addressing mental health problems is not about, in this case, reducing stress. It's not about changing the individual person. It's not about intervening at all with the autistic person. All it is about helping that autistic person gain access to meaningful recreational activities. That's the intervention. What we did, I talked about thriving, so I want to summarize of that with a study we did on a mediational study on thriving in autism and intellectual disability from a number of years ago. This was within, I should say, a Special Olympics sample. So a sample of young people who participate in sport, both with autism and intellectual disability or intellectual disability alone. And we looked at that link between autism and thriving. And it turns out that overall, the autistic athletes were thriving less than their non-autistic counterparts who also had intellectual disability. But what explained that difference was the fact that those autistic young people struggled more with social communication, so an individual level need, but also that they experienced less opportunities to participate in meaningful home activities and meaningful school-related activities than their peers with intellectual disability alone. And that was the most powerful explanatory piece of why they were thriving less. It wasn't because, and these were all young people with intellectual disability. So they were matched on things like adaptive behavior, or cognitive ability. That didn't explain any of the difference. There was no difference there. So these aspects of the context factors were powerful explanatory matters. I should say that what we also did in this study, or what I did as a follow-up, is we broke people up into those kind of categories. Remember we talked about flourishing or languishing and mental health problems or not, and you could be in one of four. So we grouped people into each quadrant. And we had people in every quadrant, if you remember that slide. People who were flourishing with no mental health problems, people who had thriving with mental health problems, and so on. So we had 4 groups. And the differences in those groups, we looked at what differentiates these 4 groups. You know where the differentiation was when it came to mental quality of life? The differentiation was not at all on whether they had mental health problems or not. There was no difference in the quality of life along the mental health problems dimension. But there was a difference in the quality of life along the flourishing dimension. That young people who were flourishing, if they had mental health problems or not, had a higher quality of life than those who were not flourishing, whether they had mental health problems or not. Okay, so when we talk about quality of life, we have to think of these recreational, these opportunities, these kind of ecological assets that are aligned with our individual experiences. The last model I want to share is a very innovative model or example of this in a school-based environment from Australia. So what they've done is they said, let's take this, like bring it all together. And what they do in this kind of wrap model is they have a whole school approach to their initiative where they have this inclusion index, and they measured the degree of social inclusion in a school, right? So, and after measuring that, they work with the administrators to address any barriers to meaningful social inclusion, not just physically as a person in this space, but can we move people along actual social inclusion in this space? It's not at the level of the individual or the level of the family. It's for the whole school and the whole classroom. Alongside that, they offer parent interventions for autistic young people, parents of autistic people within this high school environment, and groups for the autistic young people, autistic students in those schools. So all of this is done concurrently at the same time. And what they're starting to show is that as they do this 3-part intervention, the whole school, the family, and the individual child or young person, they are looking to see how that correlates with increased social connectedness in the school, as well as belonging and meaningful kind of engagement in the school. That's at the level of the social world, and a self-regulation at the level of the individual. And the idea is that these are related to positive well-being and mental health. So it's just a really innovative example of thinking holistically about what we mean about interventions. The last thing I want to share, I don't have time to kind of share this this video clip, but I will share describe this picture. Why do I have this picture here? This is a picture within a school in the GT in the Greater Toronto area, and these are like those Jenga blocks, right? You know, like the Jenga where you pull it out and it topples so precariously. But these are all essentially like Jenga pieces, like wood kind of blocks, built up as a tower, right? In this incredibly kind of beautiful geometric structure, right? And this is in a classroom sitting here. And when I think about what I mean by innovation, I want you to leave and think about this for the next 2 days. How can we do this for every autistic person? How can this be their lived experience? This is an autistic young person who built this in their classroom, who had tremendous strength in visual spatial design, obviously, right? And a giftedness around there. But they didn't do this alone, right? They did this with their peers with and without autism, but they did this with their peers, not just everybody adding, because not everybody has that strength. Some of their peers, all they did was not pull a block out. But that's a peer contribution, right? The most tempting thing for a child might be to be up and be like, I'm going to see what happens if I pull this. I played Jenga before, right? So what did it take for this to be successful is my question to you. It took an individual's strengths. It took peers that recognized and appreciated that individual's strengths. It took an authority figure in that environment who supported this as a classroom activity and said, this is important to us, not learning math or not learning X or Y that's in the curriculum. right? And I'll tell you, there's no giant kind of cage around this protecting it from the environment either. It also took the willingness to take risks and the willingness for this to fail, right? This probably was not built on the first go. It probably took a lot of trial and effort and perseverance to make this the way it is, right? So it took many levels of initiatives to make this work. And so how do we make that work, this kind of be the analog for all autistic people when it comes to quality of life? And here's my final thought. I know I've been alluding to final thoughts, but this is my final thoughts. This is my recipe guide, essentially, for all young people when it comes to improving quality of life. I think everybody needs to have skills and deserves interventions and supports to develop skills that help them manage stress. I think everybody deserves access to good physical health and good physical activity that's adaptive and meaningful for them. It doesn't mean it has to be the same for everybody. An experience of control over one's life. It doesn't matter whether you have a really profound intellectual disability or you're the most gifted person in the world. Everybody deserves to have agency and control and experience of a say in their life. Some degree of non-stressful relationships with someone. Right? Being able to engage, everybody has to have that with somebody in their life. But also caregivers who are nurtured and supported, a safe place more broadly to live and learn, an environment with limited stresses. I don't mean an environment with no stresses. Everybody deserves to experience stress. We all need to do that, but in a way that aligns with what we can handle. And lastly, access to meaningful activities in our community, activities that are meaningful to us, to our voice, or to the autistic voice, not to necessarily what somebody else thinks is meaningful. Okay? So again, I don't think any of this is autism specific, but certainly if we take an autism lens to this, I think we can all see how if we were able to do this for everybody, that would be quite the innovation. So that was my last slide. Well, thank you very much kind of for your attention. I'm glad to be here and I'm looking forward to engaging with you over the next 2 days. I saw you look at the watch, so I was like, oh no, that was my own anxiety. Right, that's what I was expecting some trombone in the background. So.
Yes, sorry, I'm not hearing everything totally there, Amy, but I think you mentioned my name, so I'm happy to jump in here. Thank you, Jonathan, for that very powerful and thought-provoking talk. I'm happy to monitor the questions online. So if people have questions, they can enter them into the Q&A and I will relay those. I can't necessarily see the hands in the room. So Jonathan, I'll let you answer any questions that come from the room. But maybe I'll start one off just to get things rolling. You mentioned the mental health literacy guide and working closely with autistic individuals in developing that. And I really appreciated your emphasis on a strengths approach. So I was wondering maybe if you could elaborate on that process a little bit for us.
Sure. So the mental health literacy materials were done in a process where we started out with trying to recruit a diverse group of autistic people who might not otherwise be able to contribute or don't typically contribute in these kinds of ways. And it started with working for a foundation of trust and shared understanding and transparency, right from the terms of reference onwards to the kind of sections that were decided upon, the organization of those sections. And these were, what we did is we had monthly virtual meetings for over 2 years to develop this guide, where our process was where we started us off with ideas of what could be in a section. And then we paid the autistic advisors, and that's really important. We paid them to participate in this. And we gave everybody, a month at a time to think about sections and then to give us input. And then we would have monthly Zoom meetings, and some people would be on video, other people would just be on text, other people would just be on audio. But we tried to create a flexible way that advisors could engage. And we had different groups. We had different Zoom meetings for autistic people themselves, others for caregivers of autistic people. So that was a separate, but we did this regularly, both to talk about the materials of the guide, but also just to develop relationships and connectedness and a sense of kind of how should we work together. And it wasn't all, Sean, lastly, I'll say is that it didn't work perfectly right from the start. This is it's a challenging thing to do, and there were missteps, and we learned a lot and we adapted as we went. So any, I think, innovative solution has to try to empower people to be at the center of it, but has to also be open to making mistakes and be flexible enough to adapt to those kind of ones to be better suited. So there are a few kind of hands in the room.
Thank you. Dr. Weiss, thank you for that presentation. It was great. My questions in regards to the study that you did about thriving youth with autism and intellectual disabilities. Now, did you mention that was specific to like Special Olympics programs? Okay.
That's right.
So I just wanted maybe a little bit more in on that.
Sure.
I haven't heard about it. I don't know how Special Olympics felt about it, but I probably agree with some of the results. So
yeah, so I do a lot of work with it was done with Special Olympics Canada and Special Olympics Ontario, the province of our Ontario here. Special Olympics is really that adapted sport program for people with intellectual disability across the life course. So we worked with them, and these were almost all local level athletes. So we recruited across the province young people who were registered with Special Olympics through this kind of long co-developed process. So these weren't elite athletes. These were ones who were participating weekly in bowling initiatives or track and field multi-sport kind of aspects. So they're well aware of the results here. And I think it did resonate. What we were also showing is that aspects of their sport participation are linked with thriving as well. I didn't talk about that here, but it's not the number of medals that they take home or the frequency of their sport or how high they get in terms of elite sport access. What seems to be most linked with thriving is actually aspects of the positive gains they experience of participating in the program.
So just a follow-up to that. So I'm from the United States, and what we've seen, or what I've seen, is that for those with ASD, typically the visual supports, the strategies aren't typically in place. So here at Special Olympics Canada, did they have those visual resources, whether it was the high-level athletes in the sport, or like what you're saying on those recreational activities, were those visual strategies and structures, right, social narratives, all that stuff in place?
We were surprised at how the proportion of our respondents who also had an autism diagnosis. I hypothesized far less because of those kinds of extra support needs that you had highlighted. But I suspect that while it might not be in every local level program, I suspect that there are a number of autistic people who are well suited to the individual coach or the individual activity and the individual program. So it might not have been formal adaptations at the programmatic level or at the provincial or state level, but at the individual level, I think that's what made it accessible. I should say that we did a follow-up study where we tracked after 10 years, which of those young athletes stayed involved in Special Olympics, continued to be registered, and their autism was not one of the predictors, autism diagnosis. So it kind of speaks to that for those who were able to engage, it doesn't sound like there were barriers to continued engagement relative to what other people experience. But I certainly believe that it is I think that if anything, it's probably a good example of an initiative that's well suited to learning more about how can we further adapt what we do, because we're already doing adapted sport, to take an autism informed approach, because they're already doing such flexible work.
My question, first of all, you had a fantastic presentation and you hit a few points. As somebody on the spectrum, you hit a few points that really, really had me struggling to stay confident throughout the presentation. But you had one that was particularly salient regarding like experiencing bullying and stuff like that. And I wonder, as kids progress on this, not on the spectrum, but through their lives, can that also translate into things such as workplace abuse? Because that's what I unfortunately went through a little bit of that myself in one job that I had, and it was bad enough that I finally quit. So I'm wondering, like, the bullying they experienced as a child, can that translate over into like workplace abuse and things of that nature?
That's a fantastic, a really important question that we need to answer. I don't know of any research that has followed young autistic people over time into adulthood and has looked to see whether that frequency or experiences puts them at greater risk in adulthood for it. We do know that, and I want to kind of really recognize your experience, that you're not alone in that when we do speak with autistic adults about the sources of their interpersonal violence, it's quite broad, as you would imagine. So some of that experience is workplace bullying. Others are involved or related to dating experiences or family experiences. So, or friendship experiences, and trying to just work out kind of friendship dynamics outside of the workplace. So the sources, I think, vary considerably. But and I think what I learned a lot from that research is that it's important that we don't just answer the question, does the experience of bullying in childhood put us at greater risk? It's really important that we don't blame the autistic person or look at the autistic person as the predictor over time, but really what's going on in those environments that place that autistic person at greater risk.
Is this on? Hello? Yeah. Hey, thank you, Jonathan. That was a wonderful presentation. My question is, and you'll hear more from me a little bit tomorrow, but we do a lot of work, recreational sport thing. One of our struggles now, and partially why HOMA came to us, is part of our success, we believe, is providing natural environment. And for us, it's how do we do research and some of that stuff with it still maintaining natural for the youth. So it's not another place they're going where there's somebody asking questions, somebody filling out forms, where they can just go play and still get that valuable research done. And I want to connect after to learn more, but I wonder if there's, so some of the methods you use to have like unobtrusive research that, as far as those youth know, they're just going and playing sport. They're not part of a research. They're not part of a thing. Because a lot of youth we know, if they walk into a building and there's a window, they assume it's a mirror. Or there's a mirror, they assume it's a window. And they know they're always being watched, always being measured. And ours is, so yeah, how do you do that research and methodology without affecting that natural environment to understand we're getting real results on the research of what's happening and how it's happening? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. And I could completely appreciate how that might be the view that a young person has given their earlier experiences with assessment or intervention or programs or research. A lot of the research, the caveat is a lot of our research that I highlighted is young people, is like the Special Olympics one, was through parent report. So that wasn't through, we did a separate study where we interviewed young people, the athletes themselves, but I didn't show that work. So the short answer is I think it's important that the research be done before and after the programs, not at the programs themselves with the young person per se. Don't change the programs to suit the research, change the research to suit the program. And there might be ways with appropriate consent and so on to do things like, naturalistic videotaping and recording of situations, or time samplings before. And there's a lot of those kind of innovative quantitative means. But the last thing I'll say is I think it's really critical that we consider how mixed methods and qualitative approaches, ethnographic approaches that don't require large samples and trying to put a number to something, but can use other situations to really document the lived experience, are just as valuable for research sake. We need we need that mosaic when it comes to research.
Thank you for that presentation. I thought it was excellent. My question is just, was there any sort of discussion and/or through any of the research, or the idea that what's the awareness level of people with autism with respect to the malalignment or the misalignment with individual community or individual family or community? What would be potentially their awareness? Maybe not having the skill sets to know what to do with the misalignments that you refer to, type of idea, but any sense of their awareness through any studies, stuff like that?
Well, I think awareness will likely vary, just like it does for non-autistic people. I can't tell you how many times I might be working with a non-autistic person in therapy, and our whole focus within that is to help bring awareness to those things that are happening in their lives, right? I think it varies. Certainly, some are incredibly articulate and able to have that meta cognition of being aware of themselves and their environments, for sure. And others might not be. But what I want to underscore is that I don't think that these pathways are mediated by awareness. I think that a person can the experience of being cared for, as an example, and the experience of belonging. I don't think you need to be able to reflect and articulate in words that you belong to have that experience of belonging, right? To be recognized and valued as a member of a group. So I think that certainly with the mental health literacy materials, we had a incredibly articulate and highly aware group of autistic people who were able to say to us, hey, you're missing this part of the misalignment. You're missing this aspect. You're focusing too much on this part. So some have tremendous awareness like that. Some, I would say, are one of their strengths is the fact that they're hyper aware, and they're hyper aware of deviations in their environment, and they're hyper aware of misalignments, frankly, more so than I would say I would characterize other people to be.
One last question, if there are any either in the room here physically or online.
Hi, no, nothing has come in the chat yet. We are at 12 o'clock, Amy, so I could throw one more out there, but I know you want to keep on schedule, so I think we could.
Yeah, we can move along.
Okay.
Thanks,
you,
John.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan, for, I think you expressed so beautifully for the program.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again so much, Jonathan, and for that fantastic keynote, and just for being here, recognizing how far you've traveled. We really appreciate it. As it is 10 o'clock a.m., I see that the tea and coffee has arrived. So we are going to take a 10-minute break. So you can get up, stretch, use the washroom, and then once the tea and coffee is set up, you are welcome to help yourself. So 10:10 is when we're going to come back into the room and sit back down and keep going with our program. Thank you.